Chapter 5. Cabbarus, chief minister of the realm, bent over his desk scanning a sheaf of documents. Cabbarus had the virtue of diligence with an immense capacity for drudgery, and he had been at his work since dawn. From the day of his elevation from superintendent of the royal household, he had shown himself willing and eager to accept duties the other ministers found boring. Cabbarus, as a result, had his fingers in everything, from the purchase of lobsters to the signature of death warrants. His eyes were everywhere, eyes the color of slate, unblinking, with a glance that made all on whom it rested feel, in comparison with him, less noble, less high-minded, and that their linen needed changing. The papers presently under his glance dealt with the latest steps taken against irresponsible pamphleteers and the printers who served them. Cabbarus had not yet received reports from such outlying towns as Belvista and Dorning. He expected them shortly. Meantime, he was not displeased. "The subjects of His Majesty," he was saying, "require the firmest guidance. The people yearn for it, without even realizing what it is they yearn for. These scribblers cause nothing but unrest. Their deaths, beyond question, will serve a higher purpose than their lives. The good of the kingdom. I bear them no personal animosity, but I would fail in my duty if I did otherwise. They will, at least, be spared the needless humiliation of a public trial." The chief minister's confidential secretary, Councillor Pancratz, made polite growls of approval, no more detailed answer being called for. Pancratz was a head shorter than his master, with enormous calves nearly bursting the stockings of his black court costume. Cabbarus wore no wig to cover the iron-gray hair trimmed close to his skull. Therefore his secretary dared not wear one. The courtiers had nicknamed Pancratz the minister's mastiff. Among themselves, they joked that while Cabbarus was preaching at his listeners, Pancratz was biting their legs. Time had come for the morning audience with King Augustine. Cabbarus ordered his mastiff to pack the documents in a red leather box. With Pancratz trotting 2 paces behind, Cabbarus left his quarters and made his way across the courtyard to the newer wings of the palace. These splendid areas had been raised by the king's grandfather, the second Augustine, now called the Great. The original Juliana Palace had been an ancient fortress of thick stone walls, narrow passages, dungeons, and torture chambers. Instead of tearing down the historic structure, Augustine the Great built around and added to it. In one of the watchtowers, he installed the famous Juliana bells. Their peal set the mood of the city, as if they were the voice of Marienstadt itself. Augustine IV had commanded them to remain forever silent, in perpetual mourning for the late Princess Augusta. The child had loved them. The king found them too painful reminders of his daughter. He preferred muteness to memory. Most of the old Juliana had been given over to storage and the offices of lower functionaries. Cabbarus had lived and worked there during his superintendency. As chief minister, he was entitled to sumptuous chambers in the new Juliana. He declined them. He kept his same quarters, setting an example of frugality and modesty, righteousness being always more believable when combined with dreariness. Since Augustine no longer received ministers in the audience chamber, Cabbarus went directly to the king's apartments. Taking the red box from his secretary, he allowed himself to be ushered in. Pancratz stationed himself outside the door, keeping a dog's eye on the attendants in the hall. The apartments were airless and stifling hot. Draperies blinded the casements. Spring had come early and warm, but logs blazed in the fireplace. Cabbarus set down his box on a side table and approached the king. Augustine, in a dressing gown, sat in a high-backed chair close to the fire. He barely acknowledged the presence of his chief minister. "I trust your majesty slept well," said Cabbarus, knowing that kings seldom slept more than an hour at a time. Augustine turned a feverish eye on his chief minister. The king was not a tall man. Since his loss, he had shrunk still further into himself, emptied, filled only with inner shadows. He had never ceased to blame himself for being too doting a father. Had he been less indulgent, the tragedy would not have happened. Because it was too late to take a stronger hand with his daughter, he had chosen Cabbarus to take a stronger hand with his people. Since then, Augustine had only one concern. "Have you still found none with the true gift?" asked the king. "Those who can summon the spirits of the dead?" Cabbarus stifled a sigh. He had hoped that Augustine, for once, would not bring up the matter. "Your Majesty has always been disappointed." "I charge you to find one who will not disappoint me. I will speak with my daughter. Let her spirit come to me, even from her unknown grave." "Sire, your duty is toward the living." Cabbarus did not intend pursuing this old and tiresome subject. He did not even intend discussing the contents of the box. The topic he resolved to raise this morning, as it had grown in his mind, filled him with a pleasure he would have judged indecent, had it not been directed toward the good of the kingdom. Augustine had given him the opening he sought, and he hurried on before he lost the monarch's attention. "Indeed, sire, kings have a duty even beyond the tomb. We are all, in the end, dust and ashes. Your Majesty, alas, bears the added burden of determining his successor." "There is no successor." "Precisely my point, Majesty. Queen Caroline, as a royal widow, may rule in your stead. This merely delays the question without resolving it. Your Majesty must have an heir to continue on his sacred trust." Augustine frowned. "It is no longer possible." "Permit me to say, Majesty, on the contrary, it is both possible and urgent. The law permits you to adopt one. It requires only your decree, confirmed by the assent of Queen Caroline." "Are you saying, Chief Minister, that the Queen and I should adopt a daughter?" "Not a daughter," Cabbarus replied, "joyful as that might be. Not a daughter, Majesty. A son who dreams, who hopes, who will strive to approach the wisdom, strength, and vision of his glorious, though adoptive forebears. A son who will honor your Majesty now and in the years to come." "Speak of this another time," said Augustine. "I am weary. There is, moreover, none I would consider." "None!" cried Cabbarus, dropping to his knee. "Majesty, let me reveal to you the respect, the affection, the love that has grown daily within my heart, the dream of that glorious day when I may call you father." It took the king a moment to understand his chief minister's proposal. He staggered to his feet. "You, in the place of my dead child!" The king struggled to disengage himself from the embrace of his chief minister. Cabbarus, in turn, did all he could to cling to the legs of his prospective parent. Augustine's face went gray. He stretched out his hands, groping vaguely, and toppled to the floor. In despair, not at the king's possibly fatal collapse, but its untimeliness, Cabbarus seized the monarch's wrist. The pulse beat faintly. Cabbarus climbed to his feet, flung open the door, and shouted for help. He returned to the prostrate Augustine and stood wringing his hands. Queen Caroline was there in moments. Hardly glancing at Cabbarus, she knelt beside her husband and loosened his gown and shirt. The queen still wore mourning, as she had done for 6 years past. While the king's grief had weakened him, her grief had only strengthened her. Despite her anxiety, her features were sternly controlled. When Cabbarus tried to speak, she cut him off with a gesture, and followed the attendants who bore Augustine to a couch. "Madam," protested Cabbarus, "we had scarcely begun our audience. His Majesty appeared in better case than when I left him yesterday." "His Majesty," replied the queen, "is even better case when you are absent." The court physician had now entered and was ordering the attendants, including Pancratz, to take themselves off. Dr. Torrens was still in his shirt-sleeves. His face, broad and blunt, was softened by a mane of silver hair, unpowdered, caught at the back by a common cotton ribbon. "Madam, I must ask you to withdraw," said Torrens, adding to Cabbarus, "and you too." Cabbarus glowered at the court physician. The queen went to the antechamber and sank down on a chair. Cabbarus reluctantly followed. Since the queen did not give him leave to sit, he took up a station in the middle of the room, his head bowed, hands clasped before him. Thus the queen and the chief minister shared close quarters and chilly silence until Torrens reappeared. "The king is sleeping now, a blessing in itself," he said to the queen. Dr. Torrens finished rolling down his sleeves, then addressed Cabbarus. "He has had a severe shock. You were with him, Chief Minister. I think you shall have to answer for it. I would not call it shock, said Cabbarus, looking past Torrens to the Queen. Rather say, madam, an excess of joy. His Majesty was discussing the happy prospect of adopting a son and heir. His fondest wish, his royal choice devolved upon... Cabbarus sighed and spread his hands. Myself. Public duty and personal devotion led me to accept this highest honor. For the king, the joyous excitement of that moment... How dare you, cried the Queen, how dare you speak of yourself as his adoptive heir? Such a question is raised privately between the king and me. The Queen's consent is required first and foremost, as you well know. That consent, I assure you, you will never be given. I desire Dr. Torrens here and now to witness my refusal. Publicly or privately, madam, the question must be raised, answered Cabbarus. The king is desperately ill. Yes, put in Torrens, but I can also tell you the king has no illness, not in the physical sense. His body is wasted and weakened. This might be said right, as I have tried to do, and would have done, except for the meddling of idiots like you, who set my regimens aside. The king's body may answer to common sense treatment, to food, sleep, and fresh air. His gravest illness lies in his spirit. You are saying the king is mad, exclaimed Cabbarus. This is high treason. You are more than incompetent. You are a traitor. Neither one nor the other, Torrens answered. The king is not mad. He is sick with grief, frozen in self-blame. No, I am not a traitor. I am a man who speaks his mind and faces facts. He turned to the Queen. Do not lose hope. His Majesty may in time recover. Meanwhile, I urge you, allow him to make no decision he may come to regret, and certainly not the adoption of... You go too far, Cabbarus burst out. Your trade is physic, not affairs of state. The king must and will follow the guidance of his ministers. Forgive me, said Torrens. I called you an idiot. I spoke hastily. You are not. Had I given it more thought, I would have called you a scoundrel. He bowed to the Queen. Your servant, madam. Dr. Torrens turned on his heel and strode from the chamber. Queen Caroline hurried after him. Cabbarus, about to follow and give Torrens a withering reply, thought better of it and remained there, silent. The chief minister enjoyed a gift for sniffing out possibilities without immediately understanding them. As before, when he had trusted this instinct, nothing could have been foreseen. He had risen, nevertheless, to chief minister. When the proper moment came, there would be many in the royal council to favor him as adoptive heir. As for Torrens, he would be dealt with. A plan was already shaping in his mind. It always pleased the chief minister how clear-sighted he could be in clouded circumstances.